All right. Welcome to Chapter 30, Alexander the Great. This is an overview or a review, depending on how you're using it. We'll take a quick look at some of the big points of Alexander the Great and how he was able to spread Greek culture around the known world at this time. So here's our essential question. The question is, how did Alexander the Great build his empire? And this is what we want to continue to ask ourselves and see if we can gather some evidence to hopefully be able to answer this question. So hopefully we use some of the information. This is just an overview if you're in chapter 30. Be able to answer the questions. Who is Alexander the Great? Where was he from? Where is Macedonia and what did Alexander accomplish? And this will just kind of be an overview of some of the things that you need to know for this chapter. So who was Alexander the Great? He was the son of Philip II of Macedonia. He inherited the crown of Macedonia following the murder of his father. And then what we see is that he united the Macedonian and Greek armies to defeat the Persian Empire. So that's kind of the first and foremost thing that we need to know about this. You see a map of the empire. Again, this is just a quick overview of some of these things that we're going to see here in depth in just a moment. So let's talk about the Peloponnesian War. You need to know about this to understand how King Philip was able to gain control of Greece. Now, Macedonia is this area just north of the Greek peninsula. Macedonians most definitely considered themselves Greek, but they were just kind of these guys that lived up in the northern regions, kind of these scattered tribes, until King Philip comes along. So the Peloponnesian War, what you need to know about this is that this is a war between the two Greek city-states of Sparta and Athens, and they fight on and off for 27 years. Now, of course, there were other city-states involved in this, but these are the two main players that we'll be referring to. What eventually happens is that Sparta gains control of the other city-states. Thebes comes along later on to take control, but for all intents and purposes, we need to know that Sparta really was the winner of the Peloponnesian War between them and Athens. So during this time and just this time period, Philip II is in the north and he's training and mobilizing a Macedonian army. He was able to take those scattered tribes, bring them all together, and really advance warfare in terms of his technology and his strategies. So, because of the disunification of the city-states in the south, Macedonia ultimately is able to gain control of Greece with this well-trained army that is now practicing something called the phalanx, which is a strategy that was used by King Philip and the Macedonian army. They're able to go down in Greece and gain control of the Greek city-states from the north. So here we have the Peloponnesian War. So here's some timeline of events that we need to know. So the timeline goes from 450 BCE to 300 BCE. Now remember, the numbers get smaller as you go into the future when we're talking about before Common Era. But let's take a quick look at a couple of things that we should take note of. So in 404 BCE, the Peloponnesian War ends, and we see Sparta take control of that. So then we've got 338 BCE. King Philip of Macedonia, he conquers most of Greece. There's a picture of the phalanx like we talked about earlier. They had these long spears, and they had the decided advantage when they went in to gain control of Greece and the Greek city-states to the south. So then we've got 336 BCE. And one of the things that we need to remember about this is that King Philip is murdered after he gains control of Greece. He's murdered by one of his closest bodyguards, and this is where we see the entrance of Alexander the Great. And due to the murder of King Philip, Alexander ultimately becomes king. So here we are, 334 BCE. Alexander is able to unite the Greek city-states to invade Asia Minor and go into the Persian Empire and finish the business that his father had hoped to do earlier on before his murder. And we need to know these things because how Alexander was able to do this was he united the Greeks against one common enemy. So he was able to lead the Greek city-states as well as the Macedonian army and lead them against Persia. He's looking to help his father and help his father fulfill his dream of taking over the Persian Empire. And of course, he wants to gain some wealth in his invasion of the Persian Empire. So here we have a picture of a map of Alexander the Great's empire, and this is about 323 BC. This is the height of his empire. You notice the areas that we have here. Now, some of the areas, the regions that he was able to conquer, would be some of the ones that you see on the map here. So the outline there shows you the extent of of Alexander the Great's empire, and then we see some of the big areas that he was able to conquer: parts of Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, the Persian Empire, which is a lot of the Middle Eastern, modern Middle Eastern countries, and then of course Egypt, and eventually he makes it all the way to northern India, where he eventually has to turn around. So we got to think about what problems might the size of this empire create. It's very large, it's very hard to communicate, and how are you going to keep everybody in line under one government? And that's really was the goal of Alexander the Great here. So we'll try to answer this question as we go through. So what was Alexander's plan to unite his empire? So let's take a brief overview of what he wanted to do with this. He spread Greek ideas to the areas he conquered, things like architecture, language. Another thing he does is he uses religion to try to keep his large empire united. And then the last thing that we see is he adopts the ways of the people and the conquered cultures all around. You see a couple of examples. He starts spreading things like Greek architecture. You see some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which reflect some of their religion. And then you see a tent as though a Persian king were in this tent. That's how Alexander was able to use some of their culture of having people greet him in a tent. So let's take a look here at our next thing. Let's take a deeper look at how Alexander spreads Greek ideas to the areas that he conquers. So what we have here is we have a couple of different things. One of the things that he has is he has the government officials and soldiers. They had to speak Greek. So if they were Persian or whatever, you had to speak Greek if you were going to be really in charge of one of the areas that Alexander the Great conquered. Another thing that he did was he spread Greek architecture, and he used this in many of the towns that he established and conquered throughout his wars and battles to create his empire. So he starts bringing architecture, which brings Greek people to these areas. A lot of libraries, a lot of thinking really is encouraged in these areas of Alexander the Great's empire. So, did it work? That's what we have to ask ourselves. We look at some of the evidence and we try to figure this out. There's an example of the Greek alphabet and some of the Greek architecture that you might find throughout his empire. So the next thing that he does is Alexander uses religion as a way to unify his empire. He does a couple of things here, and we'll take a look at how he's able to do this. So how Alexander the Great used religion, one of the ways is that he placed importance on conquered people's gods. So he accepted their gods the same way that he accepted the Greek gods as his religion. So he looked for ways to unify and not find differences between religions, but really come together with religions. And then another thing he did was he considered himself a god. Once the Egyptians had bestowed upon him the title of Pharaoh and the son of Amun-Ra, Alexander told the Greeks that he was the son of Zeus. So he's using this as a way to get people to be loyal to him and really understand how to remain unified in this large empire. So the next thing he does, Alexander uses culture, and we want to know how he uses the culture of conquered people to unify his empire. One of the things that he did is he encourages his troops, these Macedonian troops, to marry Persian women. And that was one way that he did it. Another way that he did it was he wore the style of clothes and the fashion of the Persians in order to show respect for their culture and those kinds of things. You know, we talked about it earlier, how he wanted to be greeted as Persian kings were greeted, in a tent with a whole ceremony that people had to do in order to be able to talk to him and that kind of thing. But these are some of the ways that he used Greek culture to unify his empire. So we saw the three things. We talked about Greek ideas being spread. We talked about how he used religion, and then we talk about how he uses culture. So after all of this, Alexander the Great does meet his demise. So the fall of Alexander the Great, where it starts to happen is they reached northern India, and his soldiers simply were exhausted and said they would not march any further. They were reaching some pretty hard terrain with high mountains and things like that. And his soldiers simply said, we can't do anymore, so they decide to turn around. Now, it takes about a year. He ends up going to Babylon in 323 BCE, where ultimately Alexander dies at the age of 33. There's a lot of controversy surrounding his death in terms of how he died, but maybe history still needs to be written on this one, and we'll see once what the scholars have to say about that. So after Alexander's death, really the empire begins to fragment and crumble. His generals begin to fight over control of these territories, and where it's left is with three separate kingdoms. The first kingdom being the Greek and Macedonian kingdom, the second being the Egyptian kingdom, and the third being the Middle Eastern kingdom, which once was the Great Persian Empire. So we see how these things come to an end, and we're talking about how Alexander the Great ultimately met his demise, I suppose, at an early age. So the legacy, the big thing we want to remember about this is Alexander spread this Greek culture. It spread ideas, it spread new things, it spread new philosophies to all these different parts of the world, and it's very interesting to see how far-reaching Greek culture really went, and that really is what we need to remember about Alexander the Great and his successes. So in the end, his soldiers refuse to continue once he gets to northern India. They don't have the gusto to move forward. Then what we see is he dies at the age of 33. He doesn't make it. He's young, and again, we don't really know how he died, but he did a lot in his short life. Then what we have is the fact that Greek culture lives on, and we see this throughout the areas that he conquered still to this day, as well as in modern day, and a lot of that has to do with how quickly Alexander was able to spread this culture. So hopefully this helps you rewind it, take another look at it, and really get that overview of some of those details that you need to know. Now, there's a lot more to know about Alexander the Great, but for all intents and purposes, this is a good overview or review to help you get ready for some of the information you might need to know. All right, have a good one. Until next time.